Welcome, everyone. Let's start with a question that has haunted humanity from Descartes to modern neuroscience. Where exactly is the you inside your head? We intuitively feel like there is a specific spot, a command center, where we sit and watch the movie of our lives unfold. But as you can see in this illustration, philosopher Dennett argues that this feeling is actually a sophisticated magic trick. The brain isn't a passive theater. It acts as the great illusionist. Notice how the brain here isn't depicted as a solid block, but as a swirling storm of papers? This represents Dennett's multiple drafts model. He suggests that consciousness isn't a unified stage, but rather a chaotic process of competing narratives. Raw sensory inputs come in, and parallel processes, or drafts, battle it out for dominance to become your conscious experience. So if there is no single stage, then who is watching the show? Why is it so hard to shake the feeling that there is a little pilot inside our heads? Let's move to the next slide to deconstruct that specific intuition, the little man inside the machine. So before we tear it all down, let's step inside the trap, what Dennett calls the intuitive trap. Look at this illustration. Does this feel familiar? Not literally, of course. I doubt you believe there's a tiny man in a flat cap sitting behind your eyes, but metaphorically? René Descartes famously proposed that the mind and body interact at a specific central point. This gave rise to the enduring myth of the Cartesian theater. It's the idea that somewhere in the brain, there is a central control room where all sensory data, like the image of that flower, comes together on a screen for you to watch. In this model, there is a distinct you, a homunculus or little man, sitting in the director's chair. This inner viewer watches the movie of your life, makes executive decisions, and pulls the levers to make your body move. And here is the problem. It feels undeniably true. Subjectively, we feel like an audience of one. It's a comforting notion because it validates our experience of having a unified self. But this creates a logical nightmare. If there is a little man inside your head interpreting the movie, who is inside his head interpreting that interpretation? It's an infinite regress. And as we're about to see on the next slide, biology doesn't wait for a director to yell action. In fact, your body often reacts long before you even know what's happening. If we dispensed with the homunculus in the last slide, that imaginary little captain steering the ship, you might still be skeptical. You might say, but wait, I feel like I'm in control. I feel like the pilot. Well, let's test that intuition against the hard data of the startle response. Imagine a loud bang goes off right next to your ear. Look at the timeline here. Your body doesn't wait for a meeting with the CEO. Within just 100 milliseconds, via the reflex arc, your muscles tense, your eyes blink, and your adrenaline spikes. You have physically reacted to the world. But here is the philosophical kicker. You, the conscious self, don't actually construct the narrative, the specific thought, what was that, until roughly 300 milliseconds later. Do you see the problem? Your body has already acted, ducked, and covered before your conscious mind has even opened the file. Neuroscience reveals there is no central processing unit that approves this action. The reaction bypasses the you entirely. So if the body responds before the captain is even aware of the threat, we have to ask a difficult question. Who is actually in charge here? If the brain isn't a hierarchy with a single commander, how does it organize this chaos? To answer that, we have to stop thinking like a monarchy and start thinking like a busy newsroom. So, if the biological evidence from the previous slide proves that our bodies often react before we are consciously aware, we have to abandon the idea of a central theater where a single decision maker sits. But if there's no captain at the wheel, what is running the ship? Dennett proposes we visualize the mind as a chaotic, bustling newsroom. Look at the graphic here. You have multiple reporters, these are your sensory inputs and internal states, working simultaneously. One reporter is screaming about smell, smoke. Another is filing a story about touch, heat. A third is pulling up a file for memory, danger. Simultaneously, you have background noise like hunger or balance. Here's the crucial part. In this newsroom, there is no editor-in-chief. There is no boss deciding which story matters. Instead, these drafts of reality compete for dominance. They jostle and fight in a constant shouting match. Consciousness, according to Dennett, isn't the source of the story. Consciousness is simply the draft that wins the argument. In this example, the inputs of smoke, heat, and fear combine to drown out the hunger pangs, and the narrative that gets stamped published is, there's an intruder. But if our conscious reality is just the winning draft of a chaotic editing process, that means our perception of now is actually a retroactively built narrative. Let's look at some visual experiments that prove just how much editing our brains actually do. If the previous slide showed us the chaotic newsroom of the mind, this slide takes us into the editing suite to see just how heavy-handed the editor really is. To prove that there is no central viewer seeing things in real time, Dennett points to a classic experiment, shown here, the color phi phenomenon. Look at the top diagram, reality. Physically, a red dot flashes on the left, followed quickly by a green dot on the right. That is the raw input. But look at the bottom timeline. That is not what you experience. Your brain perceives a single dot moving smoothly from left to right, changing from red to green mid-flight. But pause for a second and ask yourself the impossible question. How did your brain know to switch the color to green before the second dot even appeared? It didn't. It couldn't. This is the paradox. Your brain received the data about the green dot, realized a connection, and then went back in time to perform a retroactive edit. It constructed a smooth narrative to link the two events, effectively filling in the gap with a motion that never happened, painted with a color change that it couldn't have predicted. This tells us something profound about consciousness. You are not seeing the present. You are viewing a constructed narrative, a final draft that the brain delays by milliseconds to ensure continuity. We are always living slightly in the past. Now, if the brain can fabricate motion and color to create a coherent story, what implies about the raw feeling of seeing that redness or greenness? Is that a physical reality or just another functional trick of the editing suite? Let's turn to the problem of qualia to find out. So, if our visual reality is a retroactively edited narrative, as we saw in the last slide, what does that imply for our internal sensations? Surely the sharp taste of a lemon feels undeniably, uniquely real, right? This brings us to the central battleground of philosophy of mind. Imagine biting into this lemon, that immediate, raw, puckering sensation. Philosophers call that qualia. This leads to the so-called hard problem. How can physical neurons, which are just wet biological machines, create that subjective, non-physical feeling of sourness? Now, look at the diagram on the right. This is where Dennett plays the spoil sport to the mystics. He asks us to break it down. What is actually happening? First, there is citric acid detection on the tongue, then a salivary gland trigger, a motor command causes your jaw to clench, and finally, a semantic label is applied: sour. Dennett's controversial rebuttal is this: once you explain all those functions, the detection, the reaction, and the naming, you are done. There is no magic pixie dust of consciousness left over to explain. That unified, singular feeling you have, that is just the illusion of smoothness. It's merely the brain simplifying a dozen complex mechanical processes into a single file icon for your conscious mind to handle. But notice the last step in that mechanical chain, the semantic label. How does the brain categorize these raw inputs? To understand that, we need to look at the structural scaffolding that builds the mind, language. So, if we've accepted from the previous slide that qualia are really just complex functional states rather than magical internal sparks, we're left with a massive question. Who then is experiencing all of this? If the brain is just a bundle of biological processes, where does the thinker come from? This brings us to Dennett's most radical proposal, illustrated right here. We tend to intuitively believe that we have a fully formed thought inside our heads first, and then we just use language to package it up and send it out to others. Like language is just a courier service for the mind. But look at the scaffolding in this graphic. Dennett argues that language isn't just for reporting thought, it is the structural scaffolding that allows high-level thought to exist in the first place. Think about it. Without words, a dog certainly has awareness. It feels hunger, it chases a ball, but does it have a concept of next Tuesday? Can it reflect on its own past behavior and vow to be a better dog? Probably not. That complex, reflective self, the I that you cherish, is built entirely out of the words we possess. We string together memories, descriptions, and future plans into a coherent story. As the slide says, we effectively talk ourselves into existence. The internal narrative isn't describing consciousness. That narrative is the consciousness. But how exactly does a biological organ like the brain run this narrative code? To understand that, we need to look at the specific machinery required to run this program. Let's look at the Joycean machine. So we've established that language acts as the structural scaffolding for the mind. But how does that scaffolding actually function in real time? Dennett offers us a powerful computer analogy here. On the left, we have the hardware, the biological brain. It's a massive parallel processor with billions of neurons firing simultaneously. It's messy, complex, and distinct from the mind. To bridge that gap, Dennett suggests that we install a specific kind of software, language. He calls this the Joycean machine, named, of course, after James Joyce and his famous literary stream of consciousness style. Think about your own inner monologue for a moment. It usually feels linear, doesn't it? I wonder if I left the stove on. That reminds me of childhood. Look at that blue car. That linear experience is a virtual machine running on top of the parallel hardware. It imposes order on the chaos. This software creates a user interface for the brain. And here is the truly provocative part. We usually confuse that interface with an inner pilot, but Dennett argues that this interface, this ability to narrate, plan, and reflect, is what we perceive as the self. The self isn't the user of the computer, the self is the software interface. But if our self is essentially a narrated story generated by this machine, can we trust what it tells us? This leads us to a major methodological problem. How do we treat these subjective reports scientifically? Let's look at Dennett's solution for that in the next slide. So, if our minds are essentially running this linguistic Joycean software, how do we scientifically study the output? You might think the best way to understand consciousness is simply to look inside yourself. But Dennett identifies a major hurdle here. Introspection is notoriously biased. As we see on the left, we are often unreliable narrators of our own internal lives. We cannot automatically trust our own feelings to be objective facts. This brings us to Dennett's methodological solution, a concept he calls heterophenomenology. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but think of it simply as the anthropology of the mind. Look at the clipboard on the right. Instead of trying to measure the subjective, swirling cloud of emotion directly, which is impossible, we pivot. We treat the subject's report of that feeling as hard, third-person data. We aren't asking if the cloud is real. We are analyzing the fact that the machine, the person, generated a text claiming it was there. By doing this, we bridge the gap between subjective poetry and objective science. We study the story the brain tells without assuming the main character of that story, the self, is a physical object. And once we demote the self from a physical pilot to a fictional character, we have to ask, does that character actually have control? Let's look at what that means for free will. If we accept that there is no central Cartesian theater, no tiny homunculus sitting inside your brain watching the show, we run into a frightening existential question. If there is no captain at the helm, can we truly say we have free will? Dennett doesn't want us to panic. Instead, he argues that free will is what he calls a benign illusion. Look at the graphic on the screen. We all know the scientific reality. The Earth rotates. We don't stand still while the sun moves around us. Yet, in our lived experience, we still talk about the sunrise. We don't say, oh, look, the horizon is dipping due to planetary rotation. We say, the sun is rising. And that statement remains valid for navigating our human lives, even if it's technically an illusion of perspective. Dennett applies this to consciousness. Decisions aren't issued by a single command center. They emerge from that chaotic competition of drafts we've been discussing. The choice is simply the draft that won the battle for cerebral dominance. So the choice remains valid even if the machinery behind it is different than we feel it is. But this begs one final question. If decisions are just winning drafts and there is no captain, then who or what is the I that takes credit for them? Let's define that in the next slide. So if free will is arguably a benign illusion, what does that make the I that supposedly has that will? If there is no Cartesian theater, who is the audience? Dennett answers this with one of his most profound metaphors, the center of narrative gravity. Look at the diagram on the screen. In physics, every object has a center of gravity. It's the point we use to calculate balance and movement. But here is the crucial thing. A center of gravity is not a physical object. If you slice into a baseball at its exact center of gravity, you won't find a special atom there labeled center. It is simply an abstract calculation, a tool we use to predict how a body will behave. Dennett argues that the self is exactly the same thing, but for biography rather than physics. The self is not a little homunculus sitting in your brain pulling levers. Instead, it is a convenient fiction, an abstraction generated by the brain to simplify the chaos of those multiple drafts we discussed earlier. We spin a narrative to explain our behaviors to ourselves and others, and the self is simply the protagonist of that story. This is a heavy concept to land, so let's explicitly contrast this new model against the traditional view we're all used to on the next slide. Now that we've deconstructed the self as a mere center of narrative gravity, we can zoom out and appreciate the sheer magnitude of the shift Dennett is asking us to make. Look at the left side of the screen. This is the Cartesian intuition we all live with. It feels cozy, doesn't it? It feels like there is a theater inside your head where a continuous show is playing. You feel like the pilot, or the soul, sitting in the front row, watching the stream of consciousness flow by and using language to simply report on what you see. But Dennett argues that this is an illusion. He asks us to tear down that theater and replace it with the chaos on the right, the newsroom. In this model, there is no single stream of consciousness. Instead, there are multiple drafts, sensory inputs, memories, and narratives, all buzzing simultaneously, competing for fame in the brain. The self isn't the editor-in-chief sitting at a desk. The self is just the abstract point where the winning stories converge. And here is the most radical part. We stop viewing language as a tool that merely expresses pre-existing thoughts. In Dennett's view, language helps construct the thought. We spin the web of words, and Matt Webb becomes the mind. So if the theater is empty and the newsroom is running itself, what are we left with? Let's move to our final conclusion to see why realizing you are the story rather than the author might actually be liberating. Having just contrasted the old dogma with Dennett's new framework, we arrive here, the synthesis. It can be somewhat unsettling to let go of the Cartesian theater. If there is no little person inside our heads watching the movie screen of our eyes, it begs the frightening question, who am I? Did we just analyze the self out of existence? Dennett's answer is a resounding no. Losing this illusion isn't a loss of self, it's a liberation. As you see on the screen, we aren't isolated ghosts in a machine, observing nature from a VIP box. We are complex biological systems fully woven into nature. Think back to our multiple drafts metaphor one last time. Your identity isn't a fixed, hardbound book that was written at birth. It is a final draft, a fleeting, cohesive narrative that your brain is constantly editing, rewriting, and revising in real time. So, as we conclude our exploration of consciousness, I invite you to shift your perspective. Don't look for a hidden author pulling the strings behind the curtain. Instead, realize that the biological machinery and the narrative are one and the same. We are the authors of the stories we tell, yes, but in the most profound sense, we are the stories themselves. Thank you for exploring the architecture of your own mind with me.